Alright, so now that we've had a chance to go through everything related to kind of this first look at classes, I want to kind of wrap up on this chapter by taking a look at one more aspect of this. This is primarily going to be for people that are looking at kind of a review of this section and trying to get into JavaFX. I want to kind of show a combination of creating your own custom class and then using that in a GUI application. So what I'm going to be doing for this one is reusing this rectangle class that we put together. Primarily the things I'm going to be focusing on are the constructor. We need to go ahead and build some objects, or primarily just one object. We're also going to be using things like the get length, the set length, the get width, and set width to be able to kind of update the length and width of this particular object, and then be able to get that information so we can display that in our GUI application. In addition to actually displaying the information, so we'll kind of list it off in a label, I'm also going to be making use out of a little bit of a CSS trick to actually provide a visual representation of a rectangle object, so actually try to draw out the shape in that GUI application. So the first thing I'm going to need to do is make sure that I have this rectangle.java. So we're going to need to actually get this file and put this into our new project for our JavaFX application. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy this. So I'm going to have it selected in my project directory over here. Go ahead and copy that. I'm going to go ahead and create a new project. So this will be a JavaFX application. Go ahead and click Next. For this one, I'm going to go ahead and call this my rectangle gallery. Go ahead and click Finish. And so this is going to go ahead and create my new project. So I've got my rectangle gallery over here. This rectangle.java file right here is still pertaining to this one. So I'm going to go ahead and close this. And then also go ahead and close my rectangle demo. I'm not really going to need that anymore. In my rectangle gallery, I'm going to go ahead and open up source packages. Go into this rectangle gallery package. Go ahead and select this package. I'm going to go ahead and paste, do a refactor copy so that we can go ahead and put the rectangle class into this package. And by doing a refactor, I'm going to go ahead and make sure that the package statement at the very top of this file is updated to say that it's in the rectangle gallery package. So go ahead and click refactor. And so now I've got all that code that I just copied over, plus on this very first statement right here, we're specifying the correct package for it. So now we're ready to use this inside of this project. So as far as this file is concerned, we don't really need to modify anything inside of it. If you'd like, you can go ahead and leave this open as a reference to double check some of the different methods that you're going to be using. So you're going to be using the rectangles constructor as well as the getters and setters. But as far as that's concerned, we're done with this. I'm going to go ahead and just leave that and focus primarily on this rectangle gallery file. So inside of this, we're going to go ahead and put together the actual GUI application that's going to be using that rectangle class. So the first thing I'm going to go ahead and do is just get rid of the extra comments that I don't need. Just go ahead and remove this stuff right here. I'll go ahead and clean up the style and remove the extra initial default code that it gives me for my GUI application. So all this code in the start method, just go ahead and get rid of all that. Continue to clean up some of the comments and the style. And then I'll also just go ahead and put the main method at the top of the program. And move that right there. Okay. Next thing I want to go ahead and do is clean up the different import statements for this. So for this particular application, I'm actually going to put this together in such a way that I'm going to list off the different imports in kind of grouped up categories based on some similar characteristic that they have. So the very first group I'm going to have is going to be for all of the mandatory classes or the mandatory inputs, so imports. So it's going to include things like the application, scene, and stage. In addition to that, I'm going to go ahead and start getting rid of some of the extra ones that I'm not going to need. So like this event handler and action event, I'll go ahead and just get rid of those. This button, I'm going to go ahead and cut that out and move that right here. And then the stack pane, we're not going to use that, so I'll go ahead and get rid of that as well. So this will be my first category right here with my application, scene, and stage. The next category that I'm going to put together is going to be for my different containers, so the things that come from my layout package. In this particular case, I'm going to be working with the HBox and VBox containers. So I'm going to need both of those imports. So I'm going to do import javafx.scene.layout.hbox, and then import javafx.scene.layout.vbox. In addition to those, I'm also going to be using some controls. So we've got our button already. Along with the button, we're going to have some text fields, so the user can type in a length and width for a rectangle. More specifically, when we actually put them together, it'll be a length and a height, so that they can differentiate between the two dimensions. We'll also have some labels. So these labels will be used to specify which text field is what. The labels will also be used for the outputs, so use that to display the entered length and height, and to also draw out the rectangle shape. So we'll go ahead and import both of those as well. So these will come from our control package. We've got javafx.scene.control.text field, and then import javafx.scene.control.label. And of course, we've got our button, since the user will need to click this button to actually get everything working. It'll take all the data that's in the text fields and then use that to generate the outputs. And the very last thing I'm going to include is going to be a couple of packages, or a couple of classes from the geometry package to specify some customization for this. So being able to set up things like the padding and the alignment. We need the insets and pause classes. So we'll do import javafx.geometry.insets, and then import javafx.geometry.pause. Okay, so this will be all the imports we need. Next thing we'll go ahead and do is start putting together the start method. So we'll come down here, and inside of the start method, the very first thing that I'm going to work on or focus on will just be setting up the rectangle object. So I just need a single line of code to do this. Just go ahead and make or construct that object. So we'll go ahead and specify that this is going to be for the rectangle class. So we're specifying the name of the class right there. We'll give this a name. In this case, I'm just going to call it a rect. And say this is equal to a new rectangle object. So go ahead and construct that object by calling the constructor method. For the next part, what I'm going to put together is going to be the two different pairings of a label and a text field. So we're going to have one for the height, so how tall is the rectangle going to be, and then one for the width, how wide is the rectangle going to be. So for each one of these, what I'm going to need is a label and a text field. These are going to be side by side, meaning that I'm going to need an H-box going from left to right. Also go ahead and do things like adding a little bit of spacing, positioning it with set alignment, and in a moment we'll also see that I want to kind of adjust the precise position of this very first H-box that I put together, so this very first label and text field, since this is going to be at the very top of my application. So the very first one we'll go ahead and do is going to be for the height. So we're going to have a label. We'll call this height label. This is going to be equal to a new label. And we'll go ahead and put in the text for this. We'll say height, colon, and then a space. Underneath this, we'll go ahead and write a line of code for the text field. So we're going to have our text field. Since we have this as our height label, we'll call this our height text field. This will be equal to a new text field. And for the text field, I'm not going to put any placeholder value for this or placeholder input. Instead, I'll just go ahead and leave that blank, and the user can just immediately enter their own value for that. Next, we'll go ahead and put these into an H-box. So we'll go ahead and create that H-box. Again, since we're calling this the height label and the height text field, we'll go ahead and make this our height H-box. This will be equal to a new H-box. And right here, I'll go ahead and specify 5 as the spacing. So I'll have just a little bit of extra spacing on top of that spacing that I have right there. So keep them kind of spread apart. We'll do the height label. So this is going to be located on the left. So we'll put that in as the second argument for our HBox's constructor. And then we'll have the height text field. So that's going to go on the right. We'll make that the third argument into the HBox's constructor. The next thing I'm going to go ahead and do is set up the alignment. So I want everything to be centered in its own little space within this H-box. So we'll go ahead and grab the H-box we have right here. So we're going to do height hbox, do dot set alignment, and as soon as I start setting this up, it just auto completes and just gives me the pause at center. So we want to make sure that we're using the pause class and we're calling the center constant that's within that pause class. And then the other thing I want to go ahead and do is set up some padding on the top of this particular hbox. So again, as I mentioned, because this is the topmost element of my GUI application, if I don't do any padding with this, it would just be kind of pressed right against the upper edge of the application window. I don't really want that. I want it to be positioned a little bit away from that. So I'm going to add a little bit of padding to the top portion, or kind of just above it. So I'm going to say our height hbox. I'm going to use set padding. This one, we're going to go ahead and do a new insets, and it looks like it auto-completed and removed that. I'll fix that in a moment when I start putting in the object. So we're going to do a new insets object. For this one, we're going to do 10 for the top, then we'll do 0 for the right, 0 for the bottom, and 0 for the left. So we're going to use 4 values and only specify that the top needs something. And seeing as how it just removed my insets class, my import for it, I'll go ahead and fix that and put that back in by just using the warning dialog right here. Just go ahead and add that import back in. And preferably, still keep it in the same group I had it in. Okay. So for the next section, we're going to go ahead and do the same thing, but for the with label, with text field, your with hbox. One difference is that we're not going to need to set padding. Instead, once we've put all of these different components, all these different containers into a VBox, we'll be using spacing to keep them spread apart. So we won't need to do any set padding for this next part. So we're primarily repeating these first 4 lines right here, but for our width instead. I'm going to do label, with label is equal to a new label. We'll say width, that colon and a space. Next, we'll go ahead and make the text field. We got our text field, this will be our width text field. And equal to a new text field. Again, I'm going to go ahead and leave the constructor empty, so we're not going to have any placeholder input for it. We'll then go ahead and make our hbox. This will be the width hbox is equal to a new hbox object. Do the same amount of spacing as we did for our height hbox. We'll put 5 there. We'll then go ahead and have the width label on the left, and then the width text field on the right. And then finally, we want to go ahead and set up the alignment to make sure that everything is centered. So we're going to go ahead and do width hbox.set alignment. We'll go ahead and do pause.center for that. So go ahead and keep everything centered within that hbox. So the next thing I'm going to go ahead and do is going to be the element that will be just underneath these 2 label text field pairings. So underneath these is where we're going to put in the button for the application. So when the user clicks this button, it'll go ahead and generate the output. So it'll create the rectangle. So go ahead and make that next. We're going to have a button. I'm going to call the button itself make rectangle. So just kind of naming the button after what it's meant to do. Go ahead and say this is equal to a new button. And then the text, or the kind of message that I'm going to put onto this button, we're going to say create the rectangle. Okay. And a little bit later, once I've put together the different controls for this, then we'll go ahead and implement the behavior of this button. So we'll set up the event handler as well. The last thing I need to go ahead and include, though, is going to be the 2 labels for the outputs of this. So one of these labels is going to be for displaying the dimensions, and then the other one is going to be used for actually drawing out or providing the output of the visual representation of the rectangle. So we're going to have 2 labels right here. So this first one I'll call my rect dimensions label. This will be equal to a new label, and this particular label will initially be empty. So I'm just going to go ahead and specify it as an empty string to remind me of that. The other thing is going to be for the output. So for the visual representation, we're just going to create another label. So this will be the rect output label. This will be equal to my new label. And again, I'll just do an empty string. Just go ahead and specify it like so. And so the next thing I'll go ahead and do is put together the VBox. So we'll go ahead and create our VBox right here. This is going to be for the root node of my application. So this is going to be the topmost element that's going to contain all of the other content for this particular application. So this is going to have both of my HBoxes I made. It's going to hold that button, and it's going to hold those last two labels that I had to make. So I'll call this my root. So this is equal to a new VBox. We're going to go ahead and do 10 units of spacing between all of the different items. And then the order that I'm going to put these in, so the height HBox is going to be at the very top. Underneath that is going to be the width HBox. And then underneath that is going to be the button. And then underneath the button will be the two different labels. So we'll do the rect dimensions label. And then the rect output label. And considering this is getting kind of long, I'm going to go ahead and adjust it and just move the extra little bit here to the next line. So just kind of have it wrap to the next line like that. In addition, I want to go ahead and make sure that everything inside of this is placed into the top center. So it's going to be centered horizontally, but then it's going to be pushed to the top of its own little space vertically. I'm going to do root.set alignment. So I'm going to go ahead and get this. By default, if I let it autocomplete, it's going to do center. I'm just going to go ahead and correct this so that it is top center instead. So I'm going to do top underscore center for the constant that I use in the pause class. And then we'll also go ahead and set up the entire scene. So we'll kind of put together the window itself. So I'm going to say scene. This one, again, I'll just call this scene in all lowercase. This is equal to a new scene object. So the root, this VBox that I created, that's going to be the root node for my scene. And then for the dimensions, I can just go ahead and do 500 by 500. And then the last couple of things I'm going to need here for setting up the stage. We're going to go ahead and set the scene, set the title, and display the application window. So we'll do primary stage dot set scene. Go ahead and put in that scene that we just constructed. The primary stage dot set title. Right here, we're going to say that this is the rectangle gallery. And then finally, we're going to do primary stage dot show, so we can actually display the application window. So at this point, I've got all of the interface, so all of the visual content completed for this. So if we go ahead and run this, we can at least see what everything looks like now that it's all positioned. So right now, we've got our two labels right here, our two text fields, so one for the height and one for the width. We've got this little button right here for creating the rectangle. And then underneath that, we do actually have two labels. They're just empty right now, so we can't really see them. So the next thing that I want to start working on now is being able to enter some values for the height and width. So say like a 10 and a 10, clicking this button right here, and then having that output the dimensions that I entered, as well as the kind of visual representation of my rectangle. So let's go ahead and put that together next. So since we did the button right here, I'll go ahead and just do the implementation for it just underneath it. So I'll go ahead and put that right here. So we're going to go ahead and grab this button right here. For this particular one, I'm going to go ahead and do a lambda expression for this. We'll see in a moment, once I've completed the code for this, that this is kind of right at the edge of the number of lines of code that I would generally consider acceptable for a lambda expression. So there's going to be a little bit of code with this, not too much though. So we're going to do make rectangle. We're going to go ahead and call the set on action method. We'll go ahead and specify that we're doing this with our event. So that's going to be our one parameter for this. Use that arrow notation to indicate that we're moving from the parameters into the actual body of this method now. So we're going to do those curly braces. Make sure that it actually adds the other one right there. And then inside of here, so between those two curly braces, we'll go ahead and put together the body of our handle method for the event handler that we're putting together. So the very first thing I want to go ahead and do I'm not going to do too much for input validation. I'll primarily assume that the user is giving me good values, so just numeric values for the height and width. But I will go ahead and check one particular thing, which is that they actually entered something at all. So the one particular mistake that they might make is to just leave one of those input fields, or those text fields, empty. So I do want to go ahead and at least check for that. So I'm going to go ahead and include a little if statement right here to check for that. And then if those are both filled, so they both have some value inside of them, then we'll actually go ahead and start putting together the output for this application. So I'm going to go ahead and say if the height text field is not empty, so I need to use the exclamation point since I'm going to say not empty. And the way that I'll check to see if it's empty, I'm going to go ahead and grab the height text field. I'm going to get the text inside of it, and then I just want to check to see if the text inside of it is equivalent to an empty string. So I want to say if it's equal to, so equals this empty string. So this entire statement that I have right here is just saying if the height text field is not empty. And, so we're going to use a logical and for this. That right there. And we're also going to go ahead and check the same thing with the with text field. So we're going to do the same thing that we just did, but for the other text fields. We're going to say not, and then with text field. Go ahead and get the text inside of it. And then we'll go ahead and check to see if that's equal to an empty string. Next, I'll go ahead and put in the curly braces now for this. And then once I've got those curly braces in, I'm going to come back over here and kind of adjust this by just moving this extra little part to the next line. So just keep in mind that all of this right here is the condition for my if statement. And then this pair of curly braces right here indicates where the body starts. So this is going to be all of the lines that I will conditionally execute. So the first thing I'll go ahead and do is get the values that the user input into those two text fields. So we're assuming that they're not equal. And we're also just going to be working off the assumption that they gave us valid numeric data. So I'm going to go ahead and take those values and use those to set the length and width of that rectangle object that I made back at the beginning of this program. So right here at the top of the start method. So I need to go ahead and use this rect object that I have right here. And I want to go ahead and set its length and width. So coming back down here. So let's go ahead and do this with one of them. So let's say that the length corresponds to the height text field, and then the width will directly correspond to the width text field. So I'm going to say rect.setLength. And then what I need to put in right here, so we noticed before that I got the text using this little bit right here. So I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing. One thing to keep in mind is that when I get this text from one of these input fields, that is initially going to be a string. So I need to go ahead and convert that, because if we take a quick look at setLength, so we can actually use this as a chance to reference these methods. So things like setLength and setWidth, I'm going to show both of them right here, they're expecting a double. So if I try to give it a string, it's not really going to understand what to do with that. So I need to go ahead and just parse it right here. So we're going to be using the parse double method from the double class. So we're going to have double.parseDouble. And then we're going to go ahead and put into this the height text field's text. So we're going to say height text field dot get text. Okay. So we're going to include all of that here. Alternatively, there is another way that we could approach this, and I'll kind of leave it to you to explore this particular approach, which is that we could also just go ahead and overload setLength to accept a string as well as a double. So that's basically the same thing that we saw with the bank account class, where we had those different methods like its setter or the withdraw, the deposit, its constructor method that could all accept a double, or they could accept a string depending on which of the two methods you needed to use. So you could do the same thing with setLength and setWidth. I'll kind of leave it to you if you want to put it together that way. For the next line, we're going to go ahead and do setWidth. So we're going to say rect.setWidth. And then we're going to do the same thing. So we need to go ahead and parse out the double that is within the string of the with text field. So we're going to say double.parseDouble. We're going to grab that one. We're going to say that we want to do the with text field dot get text and close that off there. Okay. The next thing we'll go ahead and do is put together the text that we're going to be displaying in our rect dimensions label. So the rect dimensions label, that label is going to hold the little bit of text that just specifies what is the height and what is the width. So we'll go ahead and do that next. So we're going to do our rect dimensions label dot set text, and inside of here, the string that I'm going to be using, we're just going to say that the height is equal to, and then whatever the height happens to be. So that means we're going to have to get the length of the rectangle object. That's going to pair up with the height that we're using in our application. And then we'll also go ahead and print another line just underneath it that's going to mention that the width is equal to, and then whatever the rectangle's width happens to be. So we're going to say height equals plus, we're going to do rect dot get length. So that's going to be the first line, and then I'm going to have a new line character, so we're going to wrap to the next line, and then do width is equal to the rest. So for this part, at this point, I'll go ahead and just have this wrap to the next line. For this part, so we've got our string concatenation right here. So right here, we'll go ahead and put in the next string literal. So first I need the \n, the new line character, to kind of wrap to the next line in the actual application itself. And then we're going to say width equals plus, and then we're going to do rect.getWidth. Okay, go ahead and save that. I think I might have misspelled something somewhere. Or, oh, actually no, the problem is the fact that I need to rearrange the order. So I definitely need to make sure that the rect dimensions label and rect output label are coming before this. So I'm going to go ahead and cut the two lines for the two labels that I had right there. I'm going to go ahead and put those declarations right here. So we want to go ahead and make sure that these are declared before I actually start putting together the these setters for them. Okay, I'm going to save that. So real quick, before I move on to the output label, we'll go ahead and take a quick look at just displaying some information from the dimensions label. So I want to go ahead and take a quick look at that much. So I'll go ahead and run this once. So right now, we've got our height and width. There's nothing inside of either of these. So if I click create the rectangle, it won't do anything. That's because of that if statement that I put. And then of course, if I type into one of them but not the other, again, as long as one of these is empty, then it will not create the rectangle. So we'll go ahead and do height and width both 10, then we'll click this button, and now we can see the height is equal to 10.0 and the width is equal to 10.0. And so now the only thing that's left is to put together the actual drawing of the rectangle. Go ahead and close this. And so then for this last part, we're going to go ahead and do that just underneath where we set up the text of the dimensions label. So right here, I'm going to go ahead and get my rect output label. And for this one, I'm not going to set the text to this. Instead, I'm going to be relying on two things. One of those is going to be the border of this label. So that border, if I draw that out, looks kind of like a rectangle. And then if I rely on the padding, so the amount of spacing that I put into that label, I can use that padding to essentially replicate the idea of it having dimensions. So like kind of expanding or shrinking based on the height and width of the user inputs. So for the first thing, what I'm going to go ahead and do is just set the padding. Again, it's doing that one. Double check to make sure it didn't just try to remove that. It did not. Good. So for this one, we're going to go ahead and create a new insets. And for this one, the way that I'm going to set up the padding is going to be a little bit peculiar, but essentially what I need to do is check to see what the dimensions of my rectangle object happen to be, so the length and width. And for each one of these, I'm going to specify some padding going around the inside of my label, so the top, the right, the bottom, and the left, kind of going in that order. So if we're using the length as the height, then whenever I specify padding for the top and bottom, those two combined should equal up to whatever that length happens to be, so whatever the height that the user specified happens to be. So if I do that, so let's say I'd start with just one of these. I'm going to do rect.getLength. So if I do rect.getLength as the top padding, and then I do that again for the bottom padding, well, the overall height is going to be whatever the length was multiplied by 2. It's going to double up on those dimensions. I don't really want it to double up on the dimensions. I'd rather that it matches closely to them as it possibly can. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to get the length, but then I'm going to divide it by 2. And we're going to do this for the top and the bottom. So we're going to see that when we combine those together, we just get the length left over. Additionally, whenever I'm doing it for the left and right, I want to get the width. I run into the same problem where I need to divide it by 2. So we're going to have essentially 1/2 the width for one part of the padding, and then the other half of it for the other part of the padding. And then the same thing with the length. We have one part for the top and one part for the bottom. So I'm going to go ahead and do this as my comma separated list for the 4 different values. The other thing I want to go ahead and do is kind of move this to the next line, and ideally I want to kind of keep them lined up about like so. So I'm going to do something kind of funny with the styling of this so we can kind of see each one of the 4 different specifications for the padding, just kind of one after the other lined up like this. So for the next one, we're going to do get width divided by 2. Go ahead and repeat this, kind of tab it over a bunch, and just move that. So we have rect.getLength divided by 2. And then finally we have the last one, do rect.getWidth divided by 2. Okay. So now we can kind of see each one of them, just one underneath the other like this. So you see we've got our length right here. So this is going to be for the top padding. Underneath that is going to be the get width. So this is going to be for the right padding. Underneath that is another get length. This is going to be for the bottom padding. And then over here we've got that final get width, which is for the left padding. And then in addition to doing all this padding, I need to make sure that I'm actually drawing out this border so that we can actually see the outline of the rectangle. So for this one, I'm going to go ahead and take this rect output label. I'm just going to go ahead and set its style to make sure that the border is solid or actually visible. I'm going to do rect output label dot set style. And for this one, we'll go ahead and do fx border style. Say this is solid, and we'll go ahead and save that. So now we'll go ahead and take a quick look at this. I'll run it a couple of times to see some different dimensions, and then there's one more kind of particular thing that I want to mention about it, and one more kind of small adjustment that I want to make to this. But first I want to go ahead and display it so we can see why I'm going to be making this adjustment. So we'll go ahead and run this. So we've got everything right here. Again, if we click create the rectangle while there's nothing in it, it'll just stay empty. So let's go ahead and start putting some dimensions into this. So let's start with something like, say, 50 by 50. Click create the rectangle, and so now it'll go ahead and draw out our rectangle. But probably, even with these dimensions, you already noticed that there's something a little bit funny about it. So you specified 50 by 50, but if you look carefully at the width and the height, you can probably pretty easily tell that the height is a little bit longer than the width. So even though we specified the dimensions to be equal to each other, they're not really looking like they're equal to each other. And if I do this with slightly smaller values, say like 5 by 5, it starts to become a lot more apparent. So we can see that there's a little bit of a problem primarily with the width of it. It's a bit too narrow. So the problem that we're running into is that the height is going to be whatever the default height for a label should be. So it's kind of assuming that there might be some text input into this already. So usually the text for labels is something like 16 pixels by default. So it's kind of assuming that there's some height, some additional height to incorporate into this this particular control. So I want to kind of adjust the width to kind of make the same assumption in that along that dimension as well. So since it's doing about 16 along the height, I can go ahead and do the same thing with the width by essentially just adding 16 to that. And the easiest way I can do this to kind of show, how one corresponds to the other, or how we have these two different parts that we're combining together, I'm going to go ahead and just add 8 to both the left and right padding. So I'm going to just do another plus 8 right there, and then another plus 8 right there. We'll go ahead and save that. And now if we do it, now the dimensions will at least look pretty accurate. I'll also go ahead and show one other problem we run into, but there's not a whole lot I can do about this. So let's say we do something like 5 by 5. We click create the rectangle, and now we see something that looks more like a square, like the dimensions actually equal to each other. But a particular problem we run into, let's say I reduce this down to something like 1 by 1. You can click that there. So it'll go ahead and shrink it down just a little bit. So a kind of funny problem is that there's no way to specify that we want no content inside of the label at all. So we want to completely kind of compress that down. So if I do something kind of weird like height and width of 0, it's still going to draw out a box that looks like it has some dimensions to it. The problem there is just the fact that this little extra bit of space that we have inside of it is just assuming that there's going to be at least one character inside of that, and then this padding would be essentially 0, so the walls of this border would be pressed right against whatever's inside of that label. So there's not really much of anything that I can do about that. If you want to be able to kind of expand on this idea to create an actual rectangle shape and not just rely on this little CSS hack that I've shown you, you'd have to start relying on the paint class. But otherwise, this is going to complete everything for this particular example. So we're going to take a look at how to put together a simple GUI application that took advantage of the rectangle class by just constructing that rectangle, setting up the length and width, or based on the dimensions we see here, the height and width of that rectangle, and then displaying that to the user in this pretty useful visual representation.